Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Climate Action webinar, Visual Delight in Architecture. AIA California recognizes that the planet is experiencing an urgent climate emergency and that California should continue to elevate its position as a global leader in addressing the grave challenges of advancing climate change. To help do this, AIA California has developed an in-depth educational climate action webinar series that incorporates the AIA framework for design excellence and includes zero net carbon design education. A few quick housekeeping reminders. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted on the AIA California website, www.aiacalifornia.org, along with any additional resources shortly after today's session. Today's session qualifies for 1.5 AIA HSW learning units for those watching live, and AIA California staff will report these units for you. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions for today's presenters. You can also like a question to move it to the top of the queue. Questions that are not answered in the webinar can be made available on our website. I would like to quickly introduce today's moderator before getting this program started. Katie Ackerly, AIA CPHC, is a principal at David Baker Architects, an award-winning architecture, planning, and interiors practice dedicated to designing thoughtful places that uplift communities. Katie came to architecture from a background in building science and energy efficiency policy and holds both a Master's of Architecture and a graduate degree in building science from UC Berkeley, including studies with the Center for the Built Environment. As DBA's Sustainable Design Lead, she works to expand understanding, tools, partnerships, and best practices that advance human-centered, climate-responsive design. And now I will pass it off to Katie.
Thanks, Sarah, and welcome everybody. I'm really honored to play this role today of introducing and talking with Lisa Heschong about her recent book, Visual Delight in Architecture. So thank you everyone for joining. The program will basically address the benefits of daylighting and quality views for interior spaces and its effects on human health, including sleep quality, metabolic health, eye health, development, depression, anxiety, pain management, all the sort of multiple dimensions and ways that designing for daylight and view influence our whole selves as people. Daylighting and quality views can also play a role in early childhood development, end of life care. And so there are multiple dimensions. Lisa's book certainly touches on multiple dimensions of this. And our conversation will be kind of focusing on current design concerns as to how daylighting and view design relate to human experience, equity, sustainability, and climate change. And just a moment to thank Bill Burke for organizing this. It's with the AIA, a long time with Pacific Energy Center. And Bill will be tracking the Q&A function. So he'll be looking out for your questions and facilitating a conversation somewhat throughout the panel, but we'll sort of leave some space at the end. So now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, who will guide us through the conversation. And Sarah, if you're advancing the slide, I think we have one. There she is. Lisa Heschong is a founding principal of Heschong Mahone Group. She's a licensed architect of 30 years. At HMG, Lisa led the research team and found a correlation between more daylight and views in classrooms and improved student performance, along with improved office work performance and retail sales. Her newest book, Visual Delight in Architecture, which we'll be discussing, Daylight, Vision, and View, explores the importance of daylight and view in our lives. Her first book, Thermal Delight in Architecture, has been a classic for students of architecture for 40 years, and I certainly was influenced by that book when I decided to become an architect. So with that, take it away, Lisa.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. Let me pull up my screen. So we can get started sharing. And first, I'd like to say that that list of CEU topics that we're going to cover today is really comprehensive. And that's one of the reasons that I wrote a book that's 350 pages long. Thermal Delight was 75 pages long, but the deeper I got into it, the more there was to address. And there's basically a chapter devoted to each one of those topics in the book. We don't have time to get into all of that today. But sort of starting with this premise that windows have been part of buildings, are taken for granted, they're everywhere, and we tend not to give them a lot of thought or really articulate all the many contributions that they're making to our lives. And so that was really the deep dive that I wanted to do, was to start to provide the rationale, the why windows are so essential to everything that we do inside of buildings. So back in architecture school, I was taught there's a whole lot of things that windows are providing: security, weather protection, heat flows and energy loss is where I spent most of my career, ventilation and filtration, keeping the outside out, communication, privacy, daylight. Daylight's another part where I spent a huge amount of my career. But view, to me, has been really undervalued or poorly articulated, poorly researched. Things are beginning to turn around in that area, and that's where I really want to focus today. And I see an existential threat to both daylighting and views in our new technological world, where there's lots and lots of venture capital money going into creating daylight replicators and simulated views. Las Vegas would be the most extreme example, but there are many other examples of trying to provide some of the benefits of daylight and view via a two-dimensional simulation as opposed to the real thing. And I spend a lot of time in the book also discussing sort of the illusion of views and how that isn't sufficient. If you were paying attention back in November, you might have noticed the internet fluff up around the outrage of the proposed UC Santa Barbara dorm called Munger Hall, named after its funders. And here, interestingly, almost at the same time, there was a design being proposed by UC San Francisco for a new hospital up on Parnassus Heights. And the difference between these two buildings by the same institution, both by UC, is really striking. The hospital, strongly based in evidence-based design, a very scientific approach to what the benefits are of design, versus Munger Hall, which was one donor's fantasy of how to spend $13 billion. So just in contrast, in ICU, this is from a different hospital, but we see that daylight and view is a primary focus now for almost all patient hospital rooms, given the benefits that have been shown: reduction in anxiety, reduction in pain medication, faster healing, shorter stays in the hospital with the presence of more daylight and view, versus the Munger Hall dorm, where there was a white LED screen hidden behind a white curtain to create an illusion that there might be a window in that space. If you haven't seen the plans for this, it's just a massive building, and each one of those little gray squares is a single bedroom, of which 94% of the bedrooms in this massive dorm have no daylight, no views, and the closest access is often 200 feet away before you can get to a stair or a window. Thank you to the California AIA for writing a letter to the president of University of California protesting this. And I thought, interestingly, a contrast which was provided by Mr. Montanlenti to me, looking at the difference between the design for a prison in Denmark, where sunlight and daylight are considered to be human right, versus a dorm for college freshmen. It's rather striking. So that's part of the threat of technological substitutions that claim to have sufficient benefits to justify doing away with all of the architecture form that goes into designing buildings with good daylighting in view. So, as I mentioned, I've spent the last couple of years pulling this book together, which I call a why-to book as opposed to a how-to book. It provides the information and the arguments behind what the physiological impacts of daylighting are, what the sensual pleasure is, what the social behaviors that engage with daylighting in view are, and then at the deepest level, the cultural meanings and priorities that we give when we design buildings that provide that to all the occupants. And that's where we might get into some of these equity issues later on. So just first, thinking as an architect and thinking in terms of how to design with daylight. Daylight provides a wonderful natural rhythm to a space. And there's opportunities to just create that sense of rhythm, which then contributes to our physiological rhythms. Very importantly, daylight establishes a place in time and a time in place. It has been used to translate architecture into a whole world view, as example with Renaissance churches bringing the light and enlightenment from above. We also have a wonderful palette of colors as daylight changes throughout the day, providing a really dynamic sensibility to a space. And that color changing is certainly a feature. Here's the difference between a skylight providing a warm, bright white versus a north window providing strongly influenced blue light, and you get this balance and change going throughout the day, which helps to keep us stimulated and feeling alive. Another key point here is to just think about how big daylighting is. And I put this diagram together years ago where LEDs are providing a little spot, maybe 6 inches square, up to where monumental skylights are lighting entire spaces. So the point here being that daylighting is a very, very big design move, and it's something that needs to go into a design at the very initial conceptual first moves, helping to form everything else that's going on. I'd also like to point out that daylight modulation at the window, being able to control for the movement of the sun and the brightness of the outdoor scene, is essential for success, and you need to pay very careful attention to how you're selecting those modulations and what kind of operation controls you're giving to the occupants. On the upper right here, we have the New York Times building, which was designed with slats that create these horizontal stripes whenever they're in sunlight, and a lot of glinting off of these round poles. Ultimately, in the New York Times, the owner realized that they needed to raise these blinds by about 30 inches in order to let people see out when the sun was there, in order to fight feelings of claustrophobia. As an alternative, here's a design using microblinds, horizontal, that are controlling the sun and preserving the view simultaneously. So here we've got an example of being able to see a tree even in full sunlight. So it makes a big difference how you manage your windows. So I put together this sort of mandala trying to capture 6 of the big picture issues that I talk about, some of the science that is behind these claims in the book. And I'm going to briefly touch on two today, so we save plenty of time for conversation. The first is circadian stimulus. And as I think you all know, humans are highly visual animals. Various claims are that 70, 80, 90% of our brain is devoted to visual processing. And furthermore, making sense of our world primarily comes from visual information, from the cognitive maps that we get of being able to understand where we are in the world. But it's also an important concept here is that your eye has two very distinct functions. It is helping to provide you with sight and vision, and you remember all that from high school biology. But the new science is also helping us to understand that the light coming to the eye is an essential component of our circadian system. So two very different functions, just like the ear contributes to hearing and balance, the eye is contributing to vision and circadian rhythms. Oops. I have to go back. Previous. Another important concept, I think, is that the eye, the structure of the eye, is really a small piece of our brain. It's more than simply a camera. The structure of the retina is very similar to the structure of the neocortex. The tissue that becomes the eye and the brain start at the same place in the embryo, and then the eyes get expressed outwards. So really the way to think about it is two little bits of brain out here sensing the world and trying to make sense of it. There's a lot of pre-processing that goes on in the retina before signals are sent to the brain. So it's not a photographic image that's being sent to the brain, but one that's been pre-processed. You'll also remember from, I need to get out of this. Darn it. All right, you'll also remember from biology how we have three different cones that give us our color sensing, and putting that information together is how we make all the colors that we see in the world. That was the story 20 years ago. And then there was the discovery of a new photosensor in the eye called Melanopsin, which is uniquely sensitive to the color of the blue sky. And that photosensor is the primary connection to our circadian system, giving us these signals of daytime and nighttime. So keeping that in mind, we then go over to where this signal from melanopsin in our eyes is then being conveyed to our brain, to the pineal gland, to stimulate melatonin, melatonin being the primary orchestrator of our circadian rhythms. Again, this is a discovery that was coming forward 20 years ago. In the last few years, in the last 5 years or so, we have been discovering many more opsins. And we have also been discovering that the communication between the eye is going to many more places besides just the pineal gland. The story is getting very complex, and scientists are beginning to be able to pull out many other functionalities of this non-visual system, communicating information to our brain and helping to stimulate different functions at different times of the day. It's also very important to recognize that if the circadian system is disrupted from light at the wrong time of the day, or too much darkness that we're not expecting, or darkness at a different time, that circadian dysynchrony can cause serious health problems, starting with sleep disruption, disruption of appetite cycles as you experience during jet lag. But we're also now learning metabolic deregulation, increased risk of obesity, increased cancer susceptibility, reduced immune function. Many of these things are at a very fundamental level. So it starts tying more and more pieces of our health together. Now, I said that the melanopsin in the eye is uniquely sensitive to blue light in the range of 460 to 480 nanometers. This graphic here is showing you the spectral intensity of sunlight. The dotted line is sunlight outside of the atmosphere. The thin blue line is sunlight at sea level, and the thick blue line is the diffuse sky radiation. What's significant is that that blue sky color is the peak intensity of all of these functions. Right? So if you want to know, if the biological system wants to know, is the sun out, is it daytime, focusing on that wavelength is the certainest way to get the signal that yes, it's daytime, time to do daytime activities. And then by looking out a window at the blue sky, at sunlit objects outside, you are also getting the maximum intensity of that signal. And that's why daylighting within a space and view looking out of a space gives such a very strong signal to the circadian system. Keeping this signal, the melatonin being formed in the pineal gland, we often refer to it as the conductor of the orchestra. As your body is running not just 3, not just 10, but thousands of different rhythms simultaneously that need to be kept in coordination. And melatonin is the metronome or the conductor that helps to synchronize all these disparate rhythms and keep them functioning efficiently together. It's important to understand that melatonin is fabricated at night, and that's why you hear that exposure to blue light at night will start to shift your circadian rhythms, disrupt your sleep. So it's the exclusion of blue light at night, which is extremely important, along with the exposure to those wavelengths during the day. Here's a sort of quick ballpark estimate of order of magnitudes of exposure to different levels of blue light, depending on activity and location. So if you go for a walk outdoors, your exposure is on the order of 100,000. Looking out of a clear window without any filtration on it is on the order of 1 magnitude less, about 10,000 lux. The illumination inside of the space drops down again another order of magnitude. And then partly because of lower intensities, less interesting things to look at, and lower stimulation of the blue wavelengths, electric lighting, ambient lighting inside of the space is another order of magnitude less in terms of the power of its stimulus. So another piece of this equation, the circadian stimulus is both a function of the intensity of the light and how often we look at it, how much of it gets into our eyes, what we're looking at. So I borrow here from a study done in Switzerland at EFPL, where they did a very interesting experiment. They put their test subjects sitting at a desk parallel to a window, so the window was off to their left, and they gave them a series of 3 different types of tasks. One task, the instructions were over a phone, and you replied verbally. Another, they were on a piece of paper. And the third, they were via a computer where you're typing in the answers. And then each task was divided into 4 phases. First, where you're told what you're supposed to be doing. Then you're given a period of a minute or 2 to think about it and decide how you're going to respond. Then you get another minute or 2 to put forth your answer or output. And then there's some follow-up questions, either on the phone or a survey on the computer. How did you do? What did you think? And then they used eye tracking to see where people were looking during each one of these phases. And what they found was if they weren't tied to being having to look at the paper or look at the computer, 40% of the time they were looking out the window. Given the opportunity, throughout all of these tests, about 40% of the time people were glancing out the windows. However, during that particular thinking, what to do next, that was 80% of the time looking out the window. So this is just sort of observing a natural behavior of people responding to questions. How much time? We don't have a lot more data yet in terms of how behaviors relate to windows. But I also conducted my own little experiment once, working with a friend, the two of us working on laptops. She was sitting in that chair with her back to the window, and I was sitting perpendicular to her. She's a lawyer, she's a very fast typist, so she's typing away, writing a report, and every couple minutes she'd just sort of stop, pause, and then look out the window, and then get back to work and type away. And I sort of watched her, and after a while, I got really curious because it kept happening. It's like I started timing her and seeing how frequently these things happened and how long it lasted for. It went on for about 2 hours before we stopped for coffee. Then I asked her, so why are you looking out the window all the time? And she replied, I'm not looking out the window. That's why I sat here with my back to the window. I didn't want to be distracted. I said, well, yeah, but I've been watching you. You've been looking out the window a lot. She said, oh, well, there was the postman. He was making noise. I just had to see what the postman was doing. Well, that was one out of about 30 different interruptions. So clearly, all of that looking was completely unconscious, had not registered for her. You can try that experiment yourself sometime and just observe other people and see how often they glance outside. So that segues us over to mind wandering, another one of my favorite topics. And in psychology for a long time, mind wandering was considered to be a problem for people with attention deficit disorder or people with dementia, that they couldn't maintain focus. So mind wandering was the problem that we needed to solve. Until about 10 years ago, some researchers at Harvard conducted an interesting experiment using smartphones and pinging people randomly throughout the day saying, what are you supposed to be doing? Where are you? What are you actually doing? And from all this data, pulling it together, that the average American was spending about half of their waking hours mind wandering, thinking about something else than the task they were supposed to be on. So if that's happening so much to everyone, not just to people with a cognitive disability, surely there must be some positive aspect to this mind wandering. So within a similar time span, fMRI studies looking at the energy use in the brain began to identify that there was this unique pattern of brain activation that seemed to happen regularly in between tasks. They'd ask people to recite a poem, do a math problem, answer a question, and they'd see what pattern that task has, and then the brain would switch back to this other pattern, which they thought was a resting state. They called it the default mode network. It was what the brain defaulted to, until they began to realize that the default mode network was just as energetic as the task. So what was it doing? They began to track it more carefully, and they began to realize what the brain was doing was paying attention to the person, the body. It's now being called more of the autobiographical self. It's your brain switching back and forth between an outward task and inward self-awareness of, am I hungry? Am I uncomfortable? Do I need to drink something? Do I need to get up? What will I be doing in 5 minutes? What will I be doing tomorrow? So all this self-care, self-monitoring information is part of that default mode network, and then going back to outwardly directed tasks. So the default mode network seems to be where we especially plan for the future and also assess our past, try to learn from it and figure out how to respond next time. So studies done especially down at UC Santa Barbara have found that the more people daydreamed, the larger the working memory they had for task information, the better long-term memory consolidation they had of understanding what had happened in the past, the more planning they did for future actions, and perhaps most interestingly, the better they incubated for creative problem solving, so that if a problem had been presented to them and then they had a chance to mind wander, they provided more answers, more creative ideas, more interesting ideas based on these psychological assessments. So there were a lot of positives coming out from this mind wandering that had originally been thought to be the problem. So I'm going to leave you with that and step over to Katie. I want to just sort of point out again that I think that creating and curating beautiful views that occupants can participate in for the next 50 or 100 years is a wonderful gift that architects give to occupants of buildings. And it works on so many levels, from the physiological down to the cultural. So I'm doing my best to say this really needs to be one of our top priorities in terms of design, if we're really going to care for the occupants. So I'll leave it with that. Over to you, Katie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa. I think you did a great job in what, 20, 30 minutes, covering a lot of ground in a very succinct and helpful way. I think I have to admit that in my own practice and training in sustainable design, I think it is a very energy forward kind of approach. So right, that kind of energy resources and carbon is, especially now, really elevated in the conversation. So I know that you've mentioned right in your book, I think that you talk of daylighting as the ultimate sustainable design practice. So for my benefit and probably others who are in my camp, can you explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
Well, I recently wrote a summary of all those ideas for the AIA website, and that tries to pull all these things together. But in terms of sustainability, first of all, daylit buildings last a long time because they are easily repurposed. They create the function of a highly habitable space that can be used for many, many different purposes. So they provide that durability. I got into daylighting long ago as a passive solar designer, and designing with the sun and with the sky and with heat flows and so on, I realized that in designing passive solar buildings, I was also designing daylit buildings, and that I could optimize for both and save a great deal of energy. Even with highly efficient LEDs, that passive solar daylighting design approach can still outperform daylit buildings are an essential level of zero net energy buildings to get energy use as low as possible, right? Where we're not using any electricity during the day for lighting. It's also a very low-tech solution, or should be in general, that is easily managed and repurposed, so that that's part of its durability, is that it continues on into the future without needing an upgrade, without needing a technology fix, within a short term. So we've got that durability. We've also got resilience and reliability, that daylighting works even when the power goes out. It works even when you're in a climate emergency. So you want to be in a daylit building if you're under extreme circumstances. You also want to be in a daylit building where you can communicate with others, where you can survey your surroundings and understand if there's threats, but also use that as a form of communication with people inside and out. Becomes very important for social cohesion. We saw lots of examples of that during the pandemic when people were confined indoors, how important the daylighting became under those conditions. And then there's just the fundamental health and well-being arguments and all of the physiology that goes into our exposure to natural rhythms and to all the colors and dynamics of daylighting.
It sounds sort of like it's this enabler, right, of holistic thinking, right? That it kind of touches on all of these different levels of design decision making. And what I love about how you approach the book is, really bringing it down to what we're talking about is we're designing for human experience. And so if we think about sustainable design as really about people putting the experience of the people and their well-being first, daylight design is a good entry point for that. I just noticed in the Q&A that someone did specifically ask about if you would go into a little more detail about cultural aspects of daylighting. I know that's going off our script a little bit, but if I don't know if it might be an interesting opportunity to weave that in even.
Well, that's
or would
broad topic.
Yeah.
Let's start with equity and in terms of what a culture prioritizes and who it prioritizes daylight and view for. There was just an article in the New York Times today about one of these super tall towers going up in Brooklyn, and the question was put to the developer, so what's the cost going to be to get up to the observation tower at the top of this building? And the answer was, you have to buy or rent a unit, which are going for $6 million a piece. So, if you've got the $6 million, you can have this astonishing view, and that's all that building is about. That's about all that it is selling is view. On the other hand, I first became really intrigued with this idea of the importance of view when I went to do some post-occupancy evaluations of factories that were daylit. And they were primarily daylit with skylights, which was very cost-effective and energy efficient. But one factory had huge views, big 30-foot high by 15-foot wide window panels scattered around the factory walls. And that's all anybody wanted to talk to me about. There were all of these Latino factory workers in Los Angeles that could barely speak English, telling me that they came to work every day because of that view. And it hugely motivated them. They loved the company because the company had given them that view. I couldn't get them to talk about anything else. So there was a case where the factory worker, who is usually put into an environment which has nothing provided for occupant pleasure or comfort, really responding to the presence of view. That's the opposite of the equation. The same thing is true in terms of schools and who has to teach in the basement classroom. We need to ask those questions of almost every type of building that we do.
It seems like we each probably, if we think, take a moment to consider our personal experience, we have an example from our own lives that we can draw on. I mean, as design practitioners, and it's interesting if daylighting is this sort of enabler or hook, it has this, it's easy to understand, I guess, at this visceral level. Why do we keep getting it wrong in our practice?
That's something we would all like to really understand, and I'm sure that Bill Burke spent 20 years of his life educating at PG&E trying to understand what one thing can I tell people to help them not make mistakes. But on the one hand, designing with daylighting is something that has been well understood for centuries, and we have fabulous examples of daylit spaces from 100, 200 years ago. I was just in a old one-room schoolhouse up at the top of the mountains in Santa Cruz that was gorgeously designed with big tall windows on two sides and perfect daylighting inside of that classroom space from 150 years ago. So why have we strayed? Why is it so complicated? I think that we're being pushed both by technology and design to try new things, and that information hasn't as quickly been incorporated into our design understanding. We tend to think of buildings in terms of plans and elevations instead of three-dimensional volumes filled by the daylight and existing within space. Certainly, I think that having a really deep intuitive understanding of where the sun is going to be at all times of the year, and just have that in your head rather than relying on a computer program to show you those patterns, helps to make it easier to design intuitively relative to the sun and the sky, and also pulling together a lot of personal experience of how those spaces feel when they're designed, and finding some really good spaces and analyzing what the tricks were, why it's working. One of the tips I've given to students when they're going out to spaces is to study the shadows. And you can just hold up your hand and make a shadow and see, is there one shadow, two, or three? Do the shadows change in color? Do they change in intensity? And that starts showing you where the daylight is coming from and how it's contributing to the space. You can sort of start pulling it apart by looking at the pattern of shadows that are created within the space. So there's just more opportunities to try to create that integration so it does become easy and natural to do, and we don't make big mistakes and big goof ups.
Yeah, it's a little bit of an irony, isn't it, that where we are in our practice so much is sort of simulated, and we generate these kind of visual representations of the story we want to tell about daylight through these data graphics, right? There's so much currency because people, right, put so much weight in visual perception. Our industry sort of exploits that, right? I mean, that is our currency as architects. We communicate an idea about a lived experience, about how the space will be experienced through renderings and through photographs and through all the other ways we present our work in 2D formats. That's what we have. So something I've been thinking a lot more about is, how can we think more radically about presenting our work and gathering feedback by drawing out stories, right? By really trying to capture the human experience in more dimensions.
First, you have to have the human experience yourself, right? Mm-hmm. So you need to get on site and have that experience. And I have a story about an example with a very well-known lighting researcher who had been arguing with me for years that daylighting was no different than electric lighting. And finally, I hired him as a subcontractor and got him to come out to California. So we had a little bit of time, and I took him down the street where there were two big box stores right next to each other that were perfectly identical, using the same lighting system, but one had skylights and the other one didn't. And when I took him into the space with skylights, he was just sort of paused and went, oh my God, there really is a difference. I can feel it now with his body in the space. Whereas all of his intellectual understanding about light distribution and patterns, 40, 50 years of education had not brought him to that experience of having his body in a space. These, computer tools are fabulous, and they produce wonderful answers that you can then take to clients. You can explain what metrics are being made. You can compare information between them. So they're extremely valuable, but they don't provide that basic sense of what it is to be in the space. So you need to take every opportunity you can to go out and experience your own designs, go experience other people's designs, analyze them, understand how the computer generated graphics translated into real experience, because real experience is the bottom line.
Yeah, certainly. It's a challenge. I just love that challenge, though, for our time, especially as, as you say, biological systems are sort of becoming more something that we're paying attention to. But I find that really exciting. I do have one question about just my own practice. So David Baker Architects really focuses a lot on multifamily housing. It's a building type that, for a lot of fair reasons, you end up with a lot of double-loaded corridor flat buildings where a home has really this one window wall relationship with the outside. It's the one opportunity to build that connection. And I think it's easy in our practice to assume that because we're not designing the next like Alvar Aalto library, there's not much to play with when it comes to daylight design. Certainly I try to impress upon people in our office that because we have this one opportunity, all the ways you can tweak that window, is really valuable. But I think in general, we think of ourselves as not focusing on daylight design very much. So I guess my question is long-winded, but, what would you say to someone like me who sort of, to kind of help me believe that I too can effectively be a good daylight design and view designer?
Well, we know that multifamily housing, especially affordable multifamily housing, is hugely constrained by budget and site and construction technology, so kudos for you for working in that space. I would say, look for every opportunity that you have to not just design a window, but to design a window place, to think in terms of how people relate to that window, both on the inside and on the outside. Certainly at street level, or if there's a way to provide balconies or decks or ways to just get outside of that envelope, become very important in terms of extending the window into a space. Look for every opportunity that you can for having vertical introductions of daylight, such as stairways. Are a wonderful opportunity to bring in daylight from big tall windows that cascade down the stairs, or skylights from above that can bring light all the way down through the stair and making the stair a daylit place that people can experience and enjoy and sort of feel the attrition as they go down, or daylight goes up as they go up, draws you up into the building. Also making sure that, to the extent that you can, curating the views and understanding in that daylit space what people will be looking at. If they're looking at a sunlit environment, that's extremely interesting. So looking to the north is wonderful. But similarly, east, south, and west, being able to bring spots of sunlight into the space and paying attention to what that sunlight will hit. Certainly creating perpendicular spaces, perpendicular surfaces where that sunlight can hit and re-reflect deeper into the space can be very important. So it's basically working with the sun, working with the directionality of the light, working with the orientation as much as you can, connecting indoors to outdoors, inviting people into transitional spaces that can be more brightly daylit. It may be creating a shared solarium within the space. So whether it's a lobby or a playroom that has that attribute of being intensely lit with daylight and sunlight, just have to keep looking for all those opportunities.
That's wonderful. I love that. Yeah, make the instead of a window, think of making a window place. Well, I do want to, I want to turn it over to you, Bill. I was sort of tracking to see if there was a rush of questions. What are you seeing?
Well, no, we don't have an overwhelming number of questions yet, but we do have some questions that are about things that you've been talking about. So I thought I should introduce them now. So the question has come up about electric lighting systems, in particular, good LED color shifting systems that can match blue, circadian patterns. And so the question sort of comes up as, can those systems match the color spectrums needed to cycle it in a circadian pattern? And would that alleviate some of the deficiencies? I think related to that, there's another question about the intensity of light. And Lisa, you were just talking about that with sort of creating a solarium, that are there, as an architect helping people with non-residential buildings, I talked a lot to people over the years about control of direct sunlight. But I think we get into this question of, are there areas where in fact you want to introduce direct sunlight because the intensity of the daylight exposure has an impact? So those are two questions. One related to that, actually, why don't you take those questions and I can come back with more.
Sure. Let's start with intensity and sun exposure as opposed to daylight from the sky. The further north you go, the more inclement an environment you're in, where there's rain and snow. It's hard to spend time outdoors. The longer your winters are, the more valuable that exposure to direct sunlight comes. So whereas creating a solarium in a more tropical environment where people are likely to be outdoors a great deal, that's much less important. But when there's restrictions on how much time they can spend outdoors during the day because of climate or just the length of day and the length of the work day, it becomes more and more important. So there's a latitude and climatic urgency to that. It may not be as important in San Francisco or Los Angeles as it is in Seattle or Alaska. In terms of, now there was another question embedded in there, can electric lighting, can dynamic LEDs sufficiently replicate what's going on with daylight and sunlight? They are trying their damnedest. And the vast majority of research on this topic is funded by the electric lighting industry because they see a huge added value of being able to claim that they can replicate daylight and provide all of those benefits that normally should be coming from windows. I find it extremely frustrating. I'm a fellow of the IES, so I hear this all the time. The electric lighting industry is pushing daylighting and health, whereas the architectural industry, the glazing industry are like, nah, not a topic of compelling interest. Well, there's been huge progress in terms of understanding change in the dynamics, especially the spectral content of light. I think it's a bit oversold, and B, I think it's a bit premature. Not just a bit, it is very premature because there's so much science that is rapidly changing. We don't have the perfect formula. We don't have the perfect prescription yet. So these engineers are trying to catch up as quickly as they can with the science, but the science is racing ahead much faster. So I'm expecting us to be learning many new things in terms of how our physiology is tied to light, and that can't be brought in as quickly as the electric lighting industry would like to be brought. But now, an example would be, I was in New York last fall. I did a tour of the Empire State Building, and all of our meetings were down in the basement because that's where the management team and the maintenance team work. So there's 3 levels of basement in the Empire State Building, which is an absolutely gorgeous building with fabulous views and wonderfully daylit spaces, but all the people working to take care of the building are in the basement. So would they benefit from an electric circadian lighting regime? Certainly they would. But using it as an excuse not to provide daylighting first and foremost is where I really take umbrance.
Lisa, there's another question about view versus daylight. So I think one thing you mentioned, for example, was in that skylit store, the individual you brought in could immediately sense the difference between the skylighted store and the one that was electrically lighted. So that's saying something about even without a view, we sense daylight. But I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relation of the two. You know, I'll recount something that happened to me about 15 years ago. I was working with a number of people. There was an effort among some architects and engineers in San Francisco to promote perimeter dominated buildings, was the term that was used into code. And someone said, you know, daylighting is required in Germany. And so my task was to sort of track down what the German daylighting requirement was. And it was interesting to me that really what I discovered was that the German requirement, and I'm trying to remember, it's long enough ago that I forget the actual name of the requirement, but it really wasn't an energy requirement. It was something more similar to an OSHA requirement, where the limit really was on how far a worker could be from a window. And it seemed it was less about energy efficiency and more about view and connection to the outside. So to go back to the comment, the question, can you just talk a little bit about the dynamic of daylight and view and sort of, how they are related and how they're separate?
Well, so I think of daylight in terms of an illumination source. So it's providing the light inside of a space, and it's creating the quality of the light inside of the space with its highlights and its shadows and modulation of light. And that can be done from many different sources. View is the view out. And what's in common is that our eyes are looking at both. We're both looking at the interior environment, which is lit with daylight. But with the view, we're looking out into a sunlit, a daylit space, which is that much brighter, about an order of magnitude brighter, but also more interesting. And there is so much information that we are both consciously and unconsciously gleaning from that information that is also really important. So I've tried to pull these two apart to the extent that they can be. They're clearly interrelated. But just for example, I noticed in the chat, somebody mentioned Andrew Huberman at Stanford and his work on neurology. There's been really interesting work by him and others looking at the first thing that people look at when they go out onto a balcony. And generally, it's the horizon. If they have any anxiety about heights, their eyes tend to fixate on the horizon. That's like the soothing piece that I know where the horizon is. I will steady my eyes on this horizon until I overcome my anxiety. There are also studies looking at when we move into a new environment, what our eyes immediately focus on, and it generally tends to be doors and windows. How can I move through the space, and what can I see beyond? How can I get beyond? So these neurological studies of eye tracking are giving us a lot of insight into not just what we get pleasure from looking at, but what our brains, the information our brains are very trying to quickly seek out and understand. Where am I? When am I? And what should I be doing about it? And all that information is coming from the view. So does that help? Does that start to get at it?
Yeah, I think you're getting at it. Someone else is asking about atria or an atrium and how an atrium works with view. You know, I remember when I would talk to students about daylight, I would oftentimes talk about pre-Second World War office buildings and post-Second World War office buildings, and how pre-Second World War buildings tended to be U-shaped or E-shaped, you know, perimeter dominated with space between them for daylight. And that I think after the Second World War, with the arrival of fluorescent lighting, the belief was that we could basically fill in those gaps. And so you can just fill them in as Charlie Munger has with, you know, windowless rooms, or you can sort of create an atrium that allows more interior space. But is there, you know, obviously you can design an atrium in many, many different ways. So is there something about atrium design that would say the view into the atrium is critical to the design?
Well,
or what's in the atrium, what you're looking at in the atrium?
I mean, I would recommend using the basic concepts that more distance is better. The further away people can look, generally, the happier they are. So distance, size is good. Adding vegetation is very important. And part of that is if the trees and the plants are healthy, the people will probably be healthy too. And so there's that connection that in order to create a place that's healthy enough for plants, we are also creating a place that's healthy enough for people. Once there are plants, one starts to look for movement, whether that's birds flying in because the atrium's open, or insects, or some degree of air movement that can move the pattern of leaves within the space, that not only adds that sense of movement, but the shadows and the highlights may also have some movement, creates more dynamic environment. So adding water, which also creates reflections and movement and sound, enlivens an atria. Letting in a little bit of sun. My rule of thumb, working in Los Angeles, where there's plenty of sun, is that about 10% of the sun is adequate to really enliven a space, whereas the rest can be diffused daylight. But adding some bits of sparkle really enliven, brighten, add movement, all of that. So that's my set of recommendations for atria. Make them as big as you can. Add plants.
So
add animals and life.
Yeah. So something for both of you to address. So we've gotten a few questions about healthcare, in particular ICUs in view, and what you might want to talk a little bit more about that. But I'm going to sort of also ask Katie this, because here's a David Baker project that if you live in San Francisco, you probably have seen the Richardson apartments. And Katie, correct me if I'm wrong here, that building is for people who in many cases were homeless or had mental disabilities and are, basically it provides a
formerly
lot of
homeless.
supportive services.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if really what I'm saying here is there's health in an ICU, there's health for people in a building, the population that building is serving, who part of you're trying to serve their health as well. So did view or daylight come up as a discussion in that project, or was there something that you can think of that came up in the design with the group you were working with? And so really, I guess the question is, people are wanting to hear a little bit more about the health aspect, both from serious illness in an ICU to people with who need some support just to sort of make it through the day. Is there anything you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the link between daylight and health is really a conversation about what we know from research, which I would certainly defer to Lisa on the wealth of research that is linking those. For our practice, so Richardson is a project I cannot speak to, but what I can say is that it is a challenge with the again, as Lisa mentioned, all the constraints facing many of our projects, especially urban projects. There are lot line conditions and the priority of delivering, homes. I think I sort of said it before, where we're really left with this opportunity of leveraging, that space right at the wall, that window wall. We just completed another supportive housing project across the street from the jail and on Bryant Street, and there was a really concerted effort to examine the views of from these micro units, these studios. People are coming out of homelessness, and they're inhabiting this building, and we designed the building so that there would be a generous window sort of pointing your view towards the sort of the downtown skyline, instead of facing this kind of austere jail building across the street. So there are instances like that. I think in general, what we really excel at and pay attention to is the massing of the housing and the open space, and really seeing them not as so much of a positive and negative space, but that the open space really is in its way its own positive space. So we do a lot of times, instead of just long corridors, fingers or clusters of homes that then surround smaller courtyards. And in the case of Richardson Apartments, there was a real focus on creating a courtyard that framed a pre-existing mural that exists on the building next door. And that's a very kind of uplifting feature of that courtyard. So it goes back to the conversation of when you do look outside and you are constrained in sight, what do you see?
Yeah, Katie, just, related to that, I don't remember the architects, but I know there's a project that I am a bit familiar with in LA that was housing for formerly homeless veterans. And I was struck by the fact that the building seemed to do something that you mentioned and that Lisa mentioned, which was, it is kind of a donut, at base, kind of a donut with some variations on it. But it seemed that within that basic form, that the units sort of facing to the interior space basically had views to some pretty good landscape design, trees, plants, and that the units that faced out tended to have, as Lisa said, a place close to the window or a balcony that some of the interior units did, where some of the interior units had balconies, but some that didn't had really excellent views to greenery, and that some of the units on the outer side of the building, where the neighborhood may not have been as lush and green, had more of a sitting space next to a window or a balcony that enabled you to sort of engage with that window in a number of ways. So, it sounds like you're doing that, something like that. That's one approach that you're using at David Baker as well. Lisa, do you want to talk any more, or do you have, maybe you just want to refer people to the book, but the whole idea of the change over the last, years in sort of, that image you showed of the proposed UCSF hospital obviously was very much about view, and do you have any thoughts or any comments you want to add about that?
Well, I'm hugely heartened that there are young people all over the world that are taking this up as a subject of study. And so there is, a lot more work going on trying to disentangle all the different characteristics of view and its benefits compared to 5 years ago. It's, a dramatic shift. So I think that this is just the beginning. We will be learning more and more, and we'll be getting more guidance in terms of specifics or how to quantify things. But in my book, I'm also strongly advocating for going back to personal experience to really understand our emotional relationship with window views. Just having those deep sills where you can put plants or little objects that'll catch the light that provide that a little bit more depth to the window than just a pane of glass. And I quote extensively from this wonderful book by Matteo Pericoli, where he interviewed people all over the world about their relationship to window views, and then he sketched what it was that they were describing. So you have a collection of line drawings of images relative to these rather poetic descriptions of my relationship to a view. I'd recommend everybody give that a try. Think about your own window. I just did that with a study group working out of Europe, where we described our own windows to each other, first starting with just a picture postcard view, like that had no characteristics, no context to it. And what do you think of that view? And then gradually adding more and more personal, contextual information, personal information, until we realized that we couldn't make any sense out of a view just from the picture postcard, right? It's not just what objects are in the view or how it disaggregates into fractal elements, that there's so much cultural context that comes with it, as Katie was talking about in the transitional housing and avoiding the view of the jail. I think that was a really wise decision, because what you look at matters, and people care a great deal about whether they're fond of what they're looking at or they consider it to be an affront. And that takes us to the level of urban planning and helping to create those kinds of corridors and pathways where, say in San Francisco, people can see out to the bay. We all know that that is highly valued. Well, there's a reason for that. That's the sense of location, of where I am. And apparently that's very important to people. Otherwise, they wouldn't be spending millions of dollars for the privilege of being able to see a little bit of water sparkling off in the distance.
Lisa, here's another question. This is getting into some details or down to the nitty gritty in some ways, but what about tinted glass and, you know, the sort of journey of tinted glass where, you know, it was very much, I think, originally about energy. And then I think so I know we had a lot of blue and green glass in addition to even darker glasses. So I'm wondering if you can speak to the impact of just the color of the glass in terms of the impact of daylight, both at the sort of, you know, health, science, circadian rhythm level, and then, you know, more recently, you know, in the last 10 years, maybe even longer, I've seen a lot of people wanting to go to large areas of low iron glass, you know, almost like the complete opposite. And you know, so is low iron
Yes,
glass
yes.
better?
Let me jump in.
Yeah, okay.
Low iron glass does have a much broader transmission. And what we have been doing for energy efficiency for the last 4 decades is gradually narrowing the transmission of glass so that it more closely approximates our visual sensitivity of the 3 cones. And in the process, we've been cutting out the short wavelength, blue-violet, and we've been cutting out the red. Science is showing that those wavelengths may be very important to us biologically. And so I think as we learn more and more how all these new options are working, the arguments for providing clear glass, not tinted, reducing the impacts of low E will start to progress. And the balance will change to where it's more important to have a smaller aperture of very clear glass, so clear or low iron, rather than these much larger expanses of tinted triple low E filtering glass. So getting the full spectrum of daylight and sunlight in through the glass into the building is going to become increasingly important. That doesn't mean it has to be vast. A little bit of sunlight goes a long way in providing a lot of intensity of light. So, you know, in terms of the balance, I would argue for smaller windows with clearer glass.
And I think, correct me if I'm off here, it's saying that it comes back to the architect that she or he needs to think about, in a way, go back to some of the daylighting design that we advocated for perhaps before some of these spectrally selective glasses existed. I mean, I used to hear very much about distinguishing between a view window and a higher window that ideally brought in diffuse reflected daylight more broadly, that ideally had some shading. So it's just, my point really is that if we go in that direction, the architects need to really put some work into controlling the daylight so that we do get an energy efficient building that does provide view, that does provide some intensity, but it doesn't overheat.
Well, I think the bottom line is to understand that the color of glazing is not just an aesthetic choice, it has biological impact.
Yeah,
right.
Thank you.
So, you know, we're not just making pretty blue buildings. We're building buildings that people live inside that need to be healthy in them. There is something to be said for using more than one type of glass and for different purposes. So you can bring in a lot of daylight with a very small aperture from a skylight up above. It's extremely efficient. And then it may be that a view window or a west-facing window needs a slightly different treatment to help with the energy and thermal comfort. There have been designs using electrochromics, which, as you know, some of them have very decided tints to them, where in order to correct the appearance inside of the space when the electrochromics are very well tinted, is to leave at least one pane of glass in the space clear, which both brings in enough daylight to sort of flood out the effects of the tinted filtered light, but it also gives people a reference point of understanding what a normal window is versus this tinted, so that they can immediately calibrate and understand, oh, it's not late in the evening because everything seems dark and really blue, but rather the windows have tinted because the sun is out. And I can tell that because I can look at my reference window and it's clear, and I can see what normal brightness is. So cognitively, having that reference point seems to be important from what I've seen. So all windows don't have to be the same. There can be many solutions, but providing some clear glass to provide a big burst of daylight within the space, or a sufficient burst, should I say, is probably important.
Lisa, do you want to, have you looked much, I'm sure you have, at the value of view in terms of eye health, from sort of saying that part of the reason people perhaps stare out of the window is maybe they just want the connection to seeing things growing and life going on, but also just the shift in your eye from focusing on something close to something farther away. And that's part of what views are doing, is they actually just enable your eye to, or they make your eye.
They enable your eye and your brain to relax for a moment. And I think when I mention eye health, most people immediately go to the recommendation for most ophthalmologists. They call it 20-20-20, which is look 20 feet away for 20 seconds every 20 minutes or something, or I forget how the 320s figured in there, but every 20 minutes, take a break and look at least 20 feet away from wherever you are, to give your eyes a moment to relax, the muscles relax, but also the brain relaxes and then can recalibrate. However, that said, I've been doing a deep dive into the myopia epidemic for the last year and a half. Something most Americans don't know about, but our children are growing up nearsighted. And this has reached proportions where up to 90% of high school graduates in South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore are nearsighted. It's just epidemic proportions. In the United States, it's more like 30 to 40% of high school graduates are myopia, but this has changed within only 1 or 2 generations. So it turns out from epidemiological studies, it's not the digital media, it's not so much the near work, it's lack of exposure to daylight. The more time children spend outdoors, the less myopia they have. And that's actually now recommended as a treatment in many Asian countries, that children have to spend at least 2 hours per school day outdoors in order as a myopia prevention. So the question at hand at the moment is, if we know that being outdoors improves childhood eye development, how does that translate to daylight indoors? And that's what I'm trying to track down right now and understand how important it is logically, because we spend 90% of our lives indoors. It probably is very important. But the other key piece there is that children aren't little adults. Their eyes and their brains and their ability to process visual information is developing. They need practice. They need continuous exposure to natural conditions in order for this process to work correctly. And, you know, we as architects are responsible for the design of those environments that our children are in, where they are learning to see. So especially for children, especially for families, this attention to daylight and view seems to be particularly important.
Well, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask a question of my own here, which is that you know, we do a lot of energy modeling, and are there any particular metrics? You know, I'll put it out there. You know, I was pushing people to begin to use spatial daylight autonomy and annual sunlight exposure, which was a metric that, Lisa, you were key in developing. And I kind of thought, from my perspective, given that people are using 3D design tools more and more, that in many cases doing a modeling run on a model for spatial daylight autonomy, you know, is not that difficult at this point. So kind of, not to get too in depth into that though, do you have any thoughts on metrics for daylight? Are there metrics for views? And what's your thought about modeling? And Katie, are you able to do this on the sort of projects that you're doing?
Well, first I have to say that I'm a huge proponent of spatial daylight autonomy and annual sunlight exposure, because I helped develop them and I spent a decade bringing that to fruition. And we knew that it would be a long process for adoption and for people to start to calibrate to what the meaning of those metrics are. But the key difference between spatial daylight autonomy and others that have been in use, such as useful daylight illuminance or daylight factor, is that spatial daylight autonomy operates the window blinds in a dynamic fashion. And that's like the biggest difference in terms of the information output. So we're basically saying in spatial daylight autonomy, we know that people will close the blinds when there's too much sunlight. We have to account for that in the performance of a design. And the less reliant a design is on operable blinds, the more passive it is designed with proper exterior shading, hopefully the better it will perform. There are other metrics out there. Certainly the IES Daylight Metrics Committee that developed these two is hoping to develop others, such as Circadian Stimulus, such as view. I'd say we're a little behind on that. In the meantime, other people have started to try to develop metrics for view performance. There's lots of them popping up right and left. I would advise that look to the ones that are based on user experience as opposed to springing full out of someone's brain and then translate it into a computer, but doesn't have a tie to how the people are actually responding to it. So you can get all kinds of information out of computers, and you can program computers to do just about anything you want. The question is, what does it mean? How important is it to people? And we have to understand that. So people are very actively working on that, and I think even more so in Europe than in the United States. There's been some very interesting studies there. So I would say stay tuned. I'm not at a position to recommend one over another at this point in time.
Well, Bill, I'm a little bit of a provocateur on this topic. This is my feeling on architects with models. I think we have a lot of interest in our office to do more quantitative simulation analysis of energy, and especially daylight, the impacts of window shades in the space. And I time after time run into the problem of getting to the point where you can generate the output, which actually is quite a quite an input of work. And there's this moment of like, I still don't have the answer. I still don't get, maybe I wasn't asking the right question. And I mean, I think my experience is peculiar because in our work in housing, we really do have a peculiar opportunity to learn from past projects and to inform future ones, because we do a lot of a similar type of thing. And so I put a very high premium when it comes to my leadership in this area in the office of site visits, being on site and making sure the conversations are being had. Just yesterday, we were visiting a site, project under construction in San Francisco. And I walked into the unit, people were checking out the finishes and, you know, like, oh, nice unit. And I went in there, I thought, man, this just seems a little darker than I'm used to, you know, from walking into these. And so I pointed out, you know, the head height of this window, imagine if it was, you know, a foot taller. So, I mean, these are basic fundamentals, but we're still seeing this type of thing and needing to kind of have these conversations of fundamentals in the office. So it's that, and getting those base specifications like in our documents when it comes to, you know, visible light transmittance and tinting and things like that, getting those properties in our documents so project managers, you know, have the right answer as much as we, you know, we do already have that answer, and then really driving home, yeah, the personal experience of our
Great.
staff in their
Great.
spaces. So maybe that's a good ending
So
point.
we're out of time. So I want to thank you both tremendously for your work and a great discussion. A few people have been asking if AIA will report their continuing ed credits. If you gave us your number when you registered, we will. Also, note in the chat, if you want to buy Lisa's book, there's a 25% discount code. As I've mentioned previously, Lisa's not making big bucks off of this. It's really, she's doing a service for us all by publishing this book. So,
Well, I've also put up my email here. And so if people have questions, I'm offering to follow up directly as best I can, because that's very much my objective, to try to facilitate daylighting education wherever possible.
yeah. So thank you both tremendously. Lisa, is there anything you want to say to close or?
Well, just thank you so much for inviting me and facilitating this conversation, because obviously I think that this is extremely important, and I have not spent a lot of time talking with architects. I've been talking with so many other professions. So this was a wonderful opportunity to start to engage with the architectural community at a deeper level.
And thank you so much for having me. I'm such an admirer, as you know, Lisa, mentor of mine, and just love your book. Everyone should get a copy.
Well, again, thank you to both of you very, very much. And with that, I think we will end the webinar. Thank you again.
Thanks, Bill.
Hang on, Bill, hang on.
Frank?